Hello and welcome to this edition of Icon, and today I'll be talking to Jaime FlorCruz, a journalist from the Philippines, but he probably knows more or better about China than a lot of Chinese, as he's lived in China for nearly 50 years and he's witnessed and even personally experienced many historical moments in the country. Let's talk to Jaime FlorCruz. Jaime FlorCruz is the former CNN Beijing bureau chief and currently an adjunct professor at Peking University. He has studied, worked, and traveled in China for over 40 years and has reported extensively on the country as a journalist since the 1980s.
I'm Jaime FlorCruz with CNN. Primarily, my question pertains to the missing airplane of Malaysian Airlines.
He has witnessed and described the most significant events in China's past 3 decades, including the country's economic and social reforms. As the longest-serving foreign correspondent in China, FlorCruz is considered the doyen of Beijing's foreign press corps. So it's such a pleasure to be able to talk to you. And we were talking about the name. Jaime is
my formal name.
The Philippine way.
It's the Philippine way, and many Filipinos have Spanish names. So Jaime is James in Spanish. So my friends also gave me a nickname, Jimmy. And
like your Chinese name.
My Chinese name came from that, Jimmy, Lucky Rice.
Oh, right.
Yes.
Because I thought it was just the name, the name of the sound.
It is transliteration of Jimmy.
But actually, Chinese characters, they do have this magic power of explaining in the auspicious way.
It is, yes. And it was given to me by my first Chinese teacher when we were in Hunan while I was working on a farm. So it has a story in itself.
History. We were talking about this before we started this interview. But the thing is, I always remember you as the CNN correspondent. You've worked for Western media for many years, and somehow many people actually told me the impression of you. Probably you, a few foreigners who know better about China than many Chinese people.
That's an exaggeration, but I'm getting close there. After all, I've lived in China for 48 years now.
48 years.
So I should know a little better about China and the nuances of the China story.
Well, we were just talking about some terms. My colleagues, younger colleagues, they didn't even follow. They didn't even know what we were talking about. So 1971, that was when you first came to China.
That's right.
As a student.
I came as a tourist.
A tourist?
It was a study tour of sorts. We were 15 Filipino student leaders invited by the China Friendship Association for a 3-week tour of China. And of course, August 1971, when we came here, China was just coming out of the messy part of the Cultural Revolution. China was just so different, both in terms of culture, in terms of politics, and the way the society was organized. I think my hair was longer than the hair of the Chinese women, because typically they had either bobbed hair or pigtails. Men also were closely cropped hair, and people invariably were either wearing gray, blue, or green Mao jackets.
The scenes, do we see a lot about those days in old magazines or foreign reports about China in those days?
Yes.
So the plan was 3 weeks, and you go back?
I couldn't go back. I was one of the 5 in the original 15 who were blacklisted in the Philippines because of our political activities then. And for fear of getting arrested, we decided to wait, not really knowing how long the wait was going to be. It turned out to be a 12-year wait. A year after that, my Philippine passport expired, and so I became a stateless citizen in China.
That's an awkward situation you were in.
Awkward is a little weak word.
Okay.
Yes.
That was like devastating.
It was a devastating situation.
Right. So how did you walk out of it?
Our Chinese hosts were kind enough to extend their invitation. They took care of our board and lodging. But then when it became clear that we couldn't go home immediately, their idea was, oh, just wait patiently. You know, they will take care of your board and lodging. Just wait patiently until you could go home. But I was a 21-year-old man who wanted to change the world. So we volunteered to go to school. The schools were not ready to enroll foreign students like us. So we volunteered to earn our keep, to work. And the Chinese said, okay, well, if you really want to work, maybe you can also do what the millions of Chinese
in China,
millions of Chinese youths are doing, which is to go down the countryside and learn about life there. So we thought that was a romantic idea. Sure, we'd love to do that. And so where? Oh, you may go to Hunan, which is the birthplace of Chairman Mao. And so we looked at the map. Hunan, great. You know, it's south of Beijing. We thought, great, at least it will be warmer. We were wrong, because the
humid and cold in winter.
It was snowing
Okay.
when we arrived in Hunan in December 1971. We were young. I had never done farm work in my life. We helped in planting rice, harvesting rice, picked tea leaves, fed pigs, dug ditches, repaired roads.
You did everything.
Did everything that I think the production figures of the farm dropped when I was there. And I suspected that the farmers, after I left the field, the farmers went back and fixed the mess I left.
They had to redo it.
Right, they had to redo it. But it was a good experience for me. After a year in the farm, I started to really pick the crumbs that I leave behind and make sure I ate it, because I knew what it took to grow that rice, for example, or vegetable. So in that sense, it changed me.
That's some critical moment, because when you came to China, you were invited by the government and positioned yourself as the onlooker. You're a visitor.
Right.
You were there just to see what's going on in China.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, you just found yourself trapped here.
And experiencing the life.
Exactly. You had no idea how long that process was going to be.
I had no idea.
So I guess the way you were prepared to face those days, it changed. Your attitude.
I had to change my attitude. I had to change the mode of thinking. And I had to overcome months and months of homesickness, loneliness, monotony. I was still going through a very difficult time. And then after that, I still couldn't go home. So the Chinese suggested, oh, maybe you can work somewhere else. A fishing corporation in Shandong, in Yantai City, where we would go on 2 trawler ships, which pulled a huge fishing net. And we would sail close to Shanghai in the Shandong Peninsula. And for 5 or 7 days, we would be sailing to catch fish or shrimp, whatever was in season.
And you became a sailor.
I became a sailor.
That sounds Filipino, though.
Well, yes, yes. And food was better, because Filipinos are not used to spicy food.
Okay.
And Hunan food was spicy. Even omelette was spicy.
You didn't know how long that was.
And I didn't know how long that was going to be. And I guess that was the hardest part. Had I known that it was going to be 12 years.
That's the hope.
That was the hope. And then I could have planned, okay, this year I'm going to do this, next year I'm going to do that. I didn't. It was living one day at a time, 1 week at a time, then later 1 month at a time. I kept telling myself, oh, I'm still young. I could outlive that president who changed my fate. And I did, but it took 12 years and more. I'm Jaime FlorCruz, and you're watching Icon on CGTN.
when we say you probably know better about China, more about China than most of the younger generation, it's not only because you've lived in China for nearly 50 years, it's because events, years like that, you've been through some of those years that most of Chinese, probably the younger generation, don't know much about. Maybe in those days you didn't realize that, but actually if you look back at those days, you will realize it's actually some critical, some historical moments you were experiencing.
Yeah, looking back, I was fortunate to have been given this front row seat of many of Chinese landmark history. I was sometimes an observant and sometimes a participant. Vicariously or directly, I was a participant of many of the changes that China went through, especially in 1976. I had just finished my 2-year course in Mandarin at the
We
Beijing,
shared the same university.
Yeah, our university, Beijing Languages Institute, known at that time. 1976 was a very fateful year for China. Chairman Mao died, Zhou Enlai died,
General
Zhu De died, and Deng Xiaoping came back to power.
End of Cultural Revolution.
Cultural Revolution. And in that period, I was wondering what will happen to China? Where to China? And that was the debate when I entered Peking University in 1977.
Again, that's also a historic moment. That's the first year that China restored its university or college entrance examination. Yes. Started to enroll new students, and you were among the first.
Yes. And again, I was lucky to have been part of that cohort of college students who got in through these very competitive college entrance exams.
Did you have to go through?
I was spared of the academic part of it because they recognized I was already a senior college student in the Philippines when I came to China. So they basically had to ascertain my Chinese language level.
I see.
There were 3 other foreign students in my class. The rest were all Chinese. And the lectures were all in Chinese. So we had to work doubly hard. In the first year at Beida, I looked like Chinese. I had short hair. I dressed like a Chinese. I had
no more long hairs.
Right. I was very punctual, for my appointments. Filipinos are notorious for being late. I had started to ask for hot water instead of cold water. I had started to like spicy food, dumplings and noodles.
You've been localized.
So in that sense, I was localized. But I had often thought about going back to the Philippines and continuing with my life there.
At the time, it became a long-term plan that you realized that it's not like a short stay anymore. It's a long stay.
Yes.
It's almost permanent. So you had to make do what you could get at the time.
Right.
And then you were also seeing the changes taking place in China, especially after Deng Xiaoping came back to power.
Right. And I was encouraged by the changes. I could see the beginning of change through the eyes of my Chinese classmates and friends. Life was beginning to get better. People's morale was going up. There was a lot of enthusiasm and expectation. For example, when I was a student, ballroom dancing was brand new. It was just a new thing, exciting thing. But at the same time, there were also people who were reluctant. Is that good? That's capitalist, right? But I remember our cafeteria, a big cafeteria in Peking University, at night would be cleared of the tables and chairs and would become a ballroom dancing place. And people were learning, tango and waltz. People were asking me, can you teach me how to teach the disco, which at that time was brand new, disco, right? And so it was exciting to be part of that process of reorientation and opening up to very diverse and sometimes very different cultural influences that's coming out of China.
Yeah, again, you were there when the country opened a new page. The historic moment, like the first new generation of college students at the time, because that was almost 10 years of accumulation of talents.
That's right.
During the Cultural Revolution, and all of a sudden they all came back, and of different ages, different backgrounds, different life experiences, and many of them have all become the pillars of the country these days.
Yes, they are now up there. They're the captains of industry, the entrepreneurs, and top officials.
Give me some names.
The Chinese Prime Minister, Li Keqiang, was one of them. He was in the first batch of Chinese students who studied law at Peking University. People's Bank of China chairman or president, Yi Gang, was one of them. And I knew them at that time. You know, they're leading the way in terms of the country, but also in the business and education as well.
So you've got a few very powerful schoolmates from Beijing.
I was lucky to have them in my Rolodex, and they have been very helpful, in not just in terms of information, but also in terms of guiding me away from mistakes and more towards what is really going on in China.
How do you see the connection between you and China at the time?
I was then a student of China, an observer of China. I wasn't sure what I was going to do after Peking University, but I knew I had to learn more about China's history so that I could connect China present and where it came from. And so learning a little bit about Chinese history was helpful when I became an accidental journalist in China. Yeah, everything was accidental. Finished all my required courses. I was just doing my thesis. And one day a friend of mine said, you know, many news organizations, American news organizations, had opened bureaus in China, and they were looking for people who were bilingual and who knew the place. I've always been interested in journalism in the Philippines. I was active in our high school newspaper. I was the editor-in-chief of our college newspaper. But I never imagined myself to be a professional journalist until this opportunity came up. So I started to work as a news assistant, a researcher for Newsweek magazine, part-time. And then I was about to graduate from Peking University. I needed a full-time job. To get my housing and all that, I needed a status as a journalist. So I moved to Time magazine, and I was hired as a full-time reporter, and that allowed me to get my press card, and I became a legitimate journalist.
So started with the Newsweek magazine, and then Time magazine, and later on CNN correspondent.
That's right.
I guess in Western media in China, on the one hand, they played a very important role in producing China. At the same time, maybe the stories they tell on Western media, sometimes Chinese readers or Chinese viewers may not necessarily agree with.
Right.
But you are someone who knew about China. Did you have always the agreement with the way they report about China?
I didn't always agree totally with the way a story is going, because the China story is always complex. Whatever is true in Beijing is not true in the western part of China, in Ningxia or whatever. And so my job, having lived and worked in China for so long, was always to inject either an element that makes this story complete.
So what's the difficult part in that communication process?
Is the preconceived ideas of what China was or is, right? It's because China was so inaccessible and so isolated for so many years that the perception of China, the image of China, was not totally right. For years, especially during the Cultural Revolution, when China was being covered from overseas, from Hong Kong, right, from a distance. From a distance. So that resulted in many preconceived ideas which were wrong. You can call it bias, you can call it prejudice, right? So fighting that was always difficult. One solution I find is to invite them over here. And I've seen that work. I've seen editors who visited China and how they changed some of their preconceived ideas and how their enthusiasm for China stories, for the nuanced stories, grew because they visited China. Seeing is believing.
You did it, and you changed some of their perceptions and the way they reported about China.
And I think China should do more of that. China should welcome those, the gatekeepers, the editors, the journalists, to come here and see for themselves.
You worked for Western media for all these years, but again, I guess you take a different perspective, see what is going on in China with Chinese people's lives. If you look back at those years again, what are the changes that were happening in China that caught your attention, that you still remembered?
The most exciting changes can be summed up in the word choices. I think I've seen China in the early years of my stay here, with the Chinese people having very little or few choices. Choices in life, choices in where they want to live, the jobs they want to do, even the spouses they want to marry. Those choices were not quite there when I first got here. And over the years, I've seen that change. The Chinese people have choices.
People were getting more open with the world, with the rest of the world too.
That's right. Those choices come with the mindset, the more open sources of things, of ideas, of lifestyle. I can imagine more and more Chinese getting their passports and traveling, and then when they come back with very different mindsets.
The horizon is different.
Wider.
Yeah. Now you're back at Beida,
yes.
Peking University, to be a professor, giving lectures to the younger generation. Yeah. So what would be the message that you would like to convey to them?
One message I tell my students is the importance of critical thinking, the importance of being skeptical, not cynical, but skeptical, because I've also learned in my years in China that sometimes you tend to just believe whatever you hear. And it's even worse now when you are bombarded every day by all sorts of information, including fake news, right? So the challenge that the students face and I face, and that I warn them against, is the tendency to just believe what you see or what you hear. And that's true for students who are wishing to be journalists, but it's also true for students who are just consumers of news. So I try to do what we call news literacy, how to be smart consumers of news in this age of bite-sized information, of instant gratification and instant news, and how to watch out for fake news, deep fake news, and the importance of this critical thinking to go and find the truth and balanced truth.
But again, I hear a lot of complaints from fellow Chinese colleagues or journalists say Western media tend to have the stereotyped images about China, the discrimination, discriminal comments or bias, prejudice. How do we deal with that? If it is not fake news, but the angle definitely is not the angle that all Chinese would agree to.
I understand the Chinese frustration on those issues because partly I think it's a matter of expectation. It's a matter of different ways of doing things or looking at things. And yes, I think sometimes our stories may be on the other hand is heavier on the dark side. But at the same time, I also think that it's a matter of what to expect from each other. I think the Chinese colleagues, Chinese reporters, are doing a good job in telling the China story your way or the Chinese way. And the Western media may have, or the foreign media may have their way. I think the solution is to have more people here on the ground who are better trained, who are familiar with the society, with the culture, the history, and the language, but also on the one hand, who are getting better access to the news, to what's going on, have a freer reign in doing their job. And then at the same time, I think the foreign media also need to keep in mind that China is a very complex story, and that they should capture the nuances of the story and to inject those nuances into whatever they're covering. It's a huge challenge.
You just told me you've been to all the provinces in China.
Yeah.
Now, pick one place if you're going to spend your retirement life there. One place that you like the most.
I think Peking University.
Peking University.
Why? Because the period was a very exciting period. That was the time when China was just in the cusp of change, just beginning to change. There was a lot of excitement and a lot of suspense. What next? So to me, that's probably the most kind of memorable and exciting time.
You started in Peking University years ago, and you would like to spend your retirement life in Peking University.
Yes, I've decided that I'll spend the rest of my life mentorship, sharing my experience, and helping young Chinese and foreign students to find their way into what I hope will be a career in China. You know, people ask me, what will you miss if I move out of China or whenever I'm not in China? I have 3 F's that I'll miss if I am not in China. Friends, food, and foot massage. My 3 F's. And that's according to their importance.
I guess you would also miss the Chinese lifestyle.
I will.
The closeness of the neighborhood.
Sure.
Of the community.
I will.
Well, luckily you don't have to worry about that. You're still in China, and I certainly look forward to reading your memoir soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.